Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Welcome back, wildlings. Found footage. Movie fans either love it or hate it, but lots and lots of folks seem to be using it. Have been since the 90s. Well, it's one thing to see it in your local theater, or on ye olde net. It's quite another to find it for real, in your own home no less. Tonight's tale of found film fuckery, part 1 of Butcherface by Dash 32. Fair warning, this'll be long. In 1997, my friend, who we'll call Chris, moved across the state. At that time, we were both 10 years old. We didn't really have much of a way to see each other, besides getting a ride from our parents to one or the other's house, which would be a hassle for our parents, so we eventually lost contact. During this time, I'd only gotten the chance to visit his house once. With this story being in this subreddit, you'd expect the house to be creepy or haunted, but it really wasn't. It was a very plain, split-level house, probably built in the early 80s, with neighbors close by, so it wasn't even secluded. Like I said, we lost contact with each other for 10 years. That is, until Chris contacted a mutual friend of ours through MySpace. I didn't even have an account on that site. We made plans to hook up and hang out. Now that we had our own means of transportation, it was a lot easier. After maybe a month of this, Chris mentioned that his family would be remodeling the house, and I offered my help. He and his father gladly accepted the offer since the previous owners apparently hadn't kept up on it themselves. So a couple of weeks later, I drove down one weekend and we started tearing up carpeting, ripping off wallpaper, etc. The basement had been changed into a room for Chris some years before, and while half of the floor was concrete, the other half seemed to have been torn up and replaced with floorboards. And one of those boards had become warped and broke, leaving it protruding up under the carpet, so they wanted to replace it, of course. We tore that carpet up and started ripping out the floorboards when we found what looked like a hole dug about 5 feet into the ground under the floor. Chris jumped down there thinking he could get better leverage to tear up the boards when he said something was down there. His father got a flashlight and we all went down to check it out. It turned out to be a very time-worn box. It looked similar to a shoebox, but it was about 3 feet long and extremely damaged by the elements. It was so tattered that you wouldn't be able to pick it up in one piece. We believed that whatever was in it would be just as damaged, but when we ripped it open, we noticed that what was in it had the added protection of a black trash bag. Chris picked up the trash bag and its contents made the sound of plastic hitting plastic. We were all curious as to what was in there, so we brought it upstairs and cut the bag open with a pair of scissors and found 24 unmarked videotapes. Chris and I were curious as to what was on them, but his father claimed that they were most likely somebody's old bootleg collection, and if we were still curious, we should check them out later after we were done for the day. Since the plan was for me to stay the night and help them out the next day, then leave that Sunday night, we decided to watch them Saturday night. Since Chris's father was tired and didn't really care what was on the tapes, he went to bed a little bit early that night. So we pulled their old VCR from the attic, hooked it up to the TV in Chris's room, and took one of the tapes out of the bag and slipped it in. Now, the tapes certainly weren't bootlegged movies like Christopher's father believed. They were the home movies of an unknown man that we eventually began to call Butcherface. There was seemingly no flow from one scene to the next, or one tape to the next. It was like he would just film something random for what was usually just a couple of minutes, and then put the camera away for God knows how long until he'd found something else that interested him. Most of the footage was random, like him turning on the camera facing a chair. He'd walk out from behind the camera to the chair, push it over onto the floor, and then walk back to the camera and turn it off. Or him playing with a random spider, which he would talk to in a low, childish voice, then end the tape with him squashing it. Or him just filming down at his feet as he walked while breathing deeply. The one thing that always stuck out about the footage is that on the few times that his face was shown, he was always seen wearing what looked like a burlap sack, tightly tied around his head with twine, with 2 eye holes cut out. He was also a big guy, easily over 6 feet tall, with a decent build, some muscle, but not all that buff. A lot of footage was quite a bit more creepy and sinister. Some of it was of him videotaping people leaving buildings and houses. He was obviously hiding somewhere across the street from these locations, and he was often breathing loudly. Even worse were the things that he videotaped himself doing. One piece of footage showed him sitting at a table with a rat trapped in a large empty pickle jar. He unscrewed the pickle jar, took the rat out, slowly put his hand on its head, and then started twisting until it stopped screaming. He twisted a little more until its head completely ripped off its body, and then turned the camera off. Another clip showed him in a barn. There was no barn on my friend's property, so we don't know where this was filmed. He turned the camera on, showing a pig tied to a post, and then walked over to the pig with an axe in his hand and hacked its head off. What was really creepy was that most of the footage was shot in what was now my friend's house. It was always dark in the footage, like this man didn't like to have the lights on, but we did recognize various locations in the house. One piece of footage was obviously shot in the living room, which showed Butcherface using a large hunting knife to cut the power cord off of something we couldn't see, wrapping the cord tightly around his arm, and grunting and moaning while doing it, then using the knife to cut deep cuts into his hand and arm. One disturbing clip showed him standing in front of a table in the kitchen. On the table was a clothing iron. He then unzipped his pants, took out his penis, and put it on the table. Then he pressed the hot iron against it. He screamed, but didn't remove the iron for a good 30 seconds, and finally took it off, limped over to the camera, and turned it off. What freaked us out the most was a clip of Butcherface in what used to be Chris's upstairs bedroom before he moved into the basement. He turned the camera on and showed the whole room covered in what appeared to be hundreds of candles. They were on every flat surface. Table, chair, shelf, didn't matter. The walls were covered in paintings of grotesque and ghostly faces. Then he walked to a corner of the room and started furiously carving something into the floor with his hunting knife. He'd stab it into the floor and drag it around, pull it out, and then stab it in again. Since that room was vacant at the moment and used for storage, and was going to be renovated anyway, Chris's father let us tear up the carpet in that area of the room. What we found was a section of the floor that had been heavily sanded down, but with no real evidence of what had been carved there. Another tape showed footage of Butcherface in that same room with even more candles. He was on his knees, facing away from the camera, with his arms in the air, screaming to be brought to the pits of pain and torture. One interesting thing about this clip was that he only had 3 fingers on his left hand, missing his pinky and ring finger. He had all 5 fingers previous to that clip, and we think that sometime between he'd cut them off. that was the last clip of that tape, and the camera appeared to run out when it stopped. The last piece of footage on the last tape showed Butcherface furiously digging the hole that we'd found in his basement. He was digging fast and breathing heavy. He was constantly grunting. His shirt was off, but he still had the mask on. After a couple of minutes of him just digging, he started talking, saying something like, "This is it. This is it. They won't know. They'll never find me. This is where I'll hide." Well, that'll make sleeping a bit more difficult, won't it? We'll see what else they come across in part 2 in a few days. Stay scary, wildlings. Don't trust the realtor. Always do your own research when buying anything expensive, and make the most of your nights.